Hi guys, is anybody watching this? Hopefully they are. So we'll just keep going, assuming people are watching, loving it, learning. I'm thinking about entering some of these into maybe the Sundance Film Festival and seeing if I can't get top prize. So this is in 4.3. This is the 2009 FRQ. This is a number one, a Big Daddy. You will get a Big Daddy FRQ on your actual AP test. 100% your Big Daddy FRQs are going to have you relate to the aggregate demand, aggregate supply curve. So you got to know what's going on. You got to be able to explain and know how it relates to the Phillips curve, the money market, the loans graph, which we're going to talk about next week, PPCs, all that good stuff. So it's critical you know ADAS. It's critical that you know how all these other graphs relate and talk to one another. So here we go. Assume that the United States economy is in long-run equilibrium. We're at full employment, all right, with an expected inflation rate of 6%, an unemployment rate of 5%, the nominal interest rate is 8%. Using a correctly labeled graph of the short-run Phillips curve, I should have drawn this out ahead of time. Please draw it with the relevant numbers. So A, okay, the Phillips curve. Remember, the Phillips curve is like the mirror image of the aggregate demand, aggregate supply curve. Well, I struggle with the Phillips curve. I'm one of those kids that, just doesn't quite, jives with me. So that's okay. I'm going to draw the aggregate demand, aggregate supply curve because I got that thing backwards, forwards, front side, flip side, whatever. So I've got my SRPC. So here's my AS and AD. I'm just going to make everything relate to it. I'm going to go back to aggregate demand, and then I'm going to have it kind of work with the long run, the Phillips curve, so I know that I'm right. All right. So I'm writing LRPC. You can obviously tell that's the LRPC. You got to know the axes. This is unemployment rate. This is inflation rate. Don't do IR. They're going to assume it's interest rate. So got to write out inflation rate. We're operating here in our economy. So here's where we are. We're at full employment. You got to give me the exact numbers. So it's 6% inflation. I would just tick it off. 6. What's my 5%, right? Because the United States is between 4 and 6%. So we're at full employment. I got to label it A, part A. Boom. Okay. When they have you label point A, it's because you're going to label a point B on the same graph. Some of you guys are drawing a separate graph. Draw it on the same graph. Do yourself a little bit of a favor. Simplify things. Calculate the real interest rates. So that's going to give me points to B, assuming I labeled everything right. I did. The answer to B, real interest rates. You got to know the formula. Real interest rates equals nominal interest rates, nominal IR, minus inflation or expected inflation. So now I'm just plugging in numbers. Well, I know my nominal interest rate is 8. Nominal interest rate is what the bank charges its customers. The inflation rate is 6%. That gives me a real interest rate of 2%. And what this means, the real interest rate is whether or not banks win on that loan. Banks are issuing loans. If it is a positive real interest rate, which it is, that is a win for the bank. And just think of it conceptually. Well, the banks are charging a higher rate to its customers, 8, than what the inflation is. So yes, they're going to win. Well, anytime inflation is greater than the nominal interest rates, the banks are going to lose. The real interest rate is negative. Remember, does inflation help lenders? No, it doesn't. It helps borrowers. So that's kind of conceptually why that answer is. So the answer there is 2, and I'm just going to box this because I want to make it look more confusing. That's why. I see some of you going, why the heck did you do that, Mr. Brady? Assume that now the Federal Reserve decides to target an inflation rate of 3%. What open market operation should the Federal Reserve use? So some vocabulary there. Open market operation, we should know, is the buying and selling of bonds. Well, the good news here is if you're totally uncertain, but you know what buying and selling is, you got a 50% chance. They're either going to buy bonds or sell bonds. But let's just go over it to make sure we know at 100%. Well, what is my inflation rate? Well, it's currently at 6%. If I want inflation to be lower, right, well, I'm going to end up somewhere over here, right, where the inflation rate is lower. So let's say I want to end up here. Well, where inflation rate is 3% here, because obviously that's 3%. How do I get 3%? How do I get A to end up to B? Well, remember, right, if it's movement along the curve, it's a result of an aggregate demand change. You should also note that open market operations is the Federal Reserve, it's monetary policy. Monetary policy is going to affect AD or AS. It is AD. So you're going to get movement on the curve. Well, how do we get movement to the right? It's because it's an aggregate demand shift to the left. So here is point B. This is where we're currently operating in the Phillips curve. Here's where we're currently operating point B here. And remember, they should be and they are the same thing. So here's B over here. Here's B right here. Because again, for price level to decrease is the same as inflation rate decreasing, right? Price level and inflation, we can think of them synonymous. Well, how if I price level is 6%, how do I get it to 3%? Well, price level needs to decrease, aggregate demand needs to decrease. Again, how do you know it's aggregate demand? Because it's monetary policy. So in order to get aggregate demand to shift to the left, to get AD to shift to the left, what open market operations? Well, remember that Bradyism, buy big, sell small. If we want our economy to shrink for aggregate demand to shift to the left, we're going to sell bonds. So the answer, the open market operations is selling. Federal Reserve is selling bonds. Let's just make sure we understand conceptually. If the Federal Reserve is selling bonds, right, well, they're selling them to who? Well, this commercial banks. That is to say, commercial banks are buying the bonds. So the commercial banks are now getting certificates. Well, how are they getting those certificates? What are they giving the Federal Reserve in exchange for those certificates, those bonds? Well, they're giving them cash. Where does that cash come from? Excess reserves, right? So the excess reserves is what the commercial banks are using. Bank of America is using its excess reserves to buy the bonds. Well, because the excess reserves are lowering, it doesn't have as much money that it can loan out. The money supply, again, is shifting to the left. Using a correctly labeled graph of the money market, here I've got to draw what I just kind of said. Show what happens to nominal interest rates. So I'm going to do it here, D. So my money market, I've got the money supply curve. It's vertical. This is the money demand curve. Well, my money supply did what? My money supply shifted to the left. So money supply shifts to the left. I'm going to label it MS dose. This is MS1. What happens to nominal interest rates? From here to here, nominal interest rates increase. So the answer to D, nominal interest rates increase. Excellent. How will the interest rate change you identified in Part D affect aggregate demand? We've already done that. So if I'm just looking up here, right, here's another reason why maybe it's helpful to draw multiple graphs. We know that aggregate demand decrease. So why does aggregate demand decrease? So AD decrease, well, because interest rates are high, which means businesses are going to be less likely to take out loans. Spending decreases, aggregate demand shifts to the left. So that's the answer to E. F, assume that the Federal Reserve action is successful. That's just fancy terms for we're currently operating here in our economy, drawing above. We're in a recessionary gap. What will happen to each of the following as the economy approaches a new long-run equilibrium? Well, what's going to happen to the short-run Phillips curve? Again, I struggle with the short-run Phillips curve, but I'm really good at the aggregate demand, aggregate supply curve. So if I'm in a recession, in the long run, what's going to happen? Well, in the long run, if we're in a recession, aggregate supply is going to shift to the right. Well, how do, if aggregate supply shifts to the right to get us to full employment, how does that relate to the Phillips curve? Well, if aggregate supply shifts to the right, it's going to be the short run Phillips curve shifting to the left. So I would draw a new short run Phillips curve. I would label it. Right here is the same as here. So what happens is the short run Phillips curve, it shifts to the left. Why? I would explain something relating to changes in wages, unemployment rate that's being high. I'll just tell you what I would say. If price level decreases, that means that businesses are earning less profit, right? Because they're earning less profit, in order to offset what they've lost, they're going to reduce wages, nominal wages. How come the employees have to take that pay cut? It's because unemployment rate is high. So because nominal wages decrease, that helps businesses. Aggregate supply shifts to the right. A rightward shift to an aggregate supply causes a leftward shift in the SRPC. Again, the rule of thumb, shifts in aggregate demand cause movement on the Phillips curve in the opposite direction. Shifts in aggregate supply cause shifts in the short run Phillips curve, again in the opposite direction. What happens to the natural rate of unemployment? The only way the natural rate of unemployment changes if there's changes in unemployment benefits. There has been no change in unemployment benefits, so the natural rate of unemployment remains 4 to 6%. So it's no change. Now that's going to get you full credit if you get that. If you get full credit on your Big Daddy FRQ, I guarantee you're going to pass the AP test. So if you're struggling with them, keep practicing. All the best to you guys. Hopefully this helped. Thank you. I'm just deleting right now. Stop